Thank you, Eddie. Good morning. If I haven't said good morning to you. Morning. Hang on. Here with me. I think Eddie was being slightly hopeful when he said Chris is going to come and speak to you for a little bit, but hey, it's been a while. So it was William Shakespeare, you will all know this, who wrote, "All the world's a stage, all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts." We all play roles in our life. It might be child, husband, wife, grandparent, friend, confidant, breadwinner. We all play roles. And sometimes it feels like we're just doing literally our best to simply get through those roles, problems and all. But this morning, I want to say, as we head into a brand new teaching series, I want us to switch our minds up and think along different lines. I want us to think along these lines, that life is not a problem to be solved, but a story to be told. Each of us has a story. Whether we acknowledge it or not, we all have a story, and we all have the potential to make that a story worth telling. I wonder if anybody's seen any biopics recently. You know, a film about somebody's life. Anybody seen any of that? We talked about Elvis a few weeks back. Elvis was a biopic. Or maybe you've read a biography, an autobiography, fairly recently. I wonder, bit of participation, I think, just to give me a chance to slurp my tea. It would be really something, wouldn't it, if they made a film of your life. I wonder what the grand themes would be that they might pick out. Is there a standout part of your story that the film would kind of major on? Imagine then, here's your little task I'm going to get you to do for a few seconds. Imagine it's raining outside. You're sat at home this afternoon in your armchair thinking, do I watch the cricket or the rugby? Do I watch what England played yesterday? Or West Indies, I think, are out of the cricket already. Sat at home, the phone rings. You pick up the phone, and it's Steven Spielberg, the well-known movie director. And he says, whatever your name is, he says, "Hi," in an American accent. He says, "We're just starting to cast for the movie of your life story. And we kind of wanted your input. Who would you like to play the role of yourself in the film?" Who would you like to play yourself in your own film? I'm going to give you a few seconds while I slurp to turn to your neighbor and just say which actor or actress you would pick to play you. If you're watching online, you can just chuck us a note in the text box and let us know. Give us a laugh. Okay, does anybody want to say, is anybody brave enough to kind of call out who they would have play them? Tom Cruise, fabulous. Mr. Bean. Do you know, I was just thinking about this myself, and my mind initially went to Robert Redford. And I thought he's probably a bit old. It's probably going to be somebody more like Kojak, to be fair, isn't it? Anyway, we're going to take a few weeks out to run through this series entitled The Story I'll Tell. Because at the end of the day, when everything's totted up, we all have a story of our life. In fact, some of you might have even thought about writing down your life story. It's a very popular thing that people start to write down some of their story. And I wonder which bits, if you wrote it down, would make the cut and which bits would be left out. I mean, if you read any biography, it's never the chapter that grabs you that says, I get up in the morning, brush my teeth, have a Weetabix, get dressed, and my day's always the same. That would be a pretty boring biography, wouldn't it? It's the stories, the little stories, the tales, the way we helped someone along the way, when life was a disaster and we were lifted or lifted ourselves out of that situation. Those are the things that kind of grab us in a biography. And the truth of the matter is, if we're going to write an autobiography, we're going to be the hero of that story. That's what we want. And I've been thinking about this over the past week or so, and I think our story changes over time. So with me, early in my life, when I started work and I started to kind of progress up the corporate ladder, the story I wanted to tell was about money and success, how well I was doing. To be honest, that's a pretty boring story. Who wants to read about someone simply doing well in business? In fact, if you read Steve Jobs' biography, Steve Jobs' autobiography, is the guy who kind of made Apple what it is today and kind of died of cancer, I think, a few years back. His story is not about success in business. It's something different to that. I think we all get to the stage whereby we want the important elements of our story to not be all about success, but to be about significance. We want to make a difference in the world. We want to leave a legacy, if you like. The great autobiographies are not about success, they're about significance. It's those things, those times, those stories that make a biography. And we all have those times. So, let's get going with this. And the story I'll tell is the title of our series. And I want to pose the question today for part one. How do we play our part in the bigger story? You know there's a bigger story going on than just your own life, right? The way we interact with family and friends and colleagues, those we come into contact with, the way we are in a much wider world. How do we play our part in that story? And to get stuck into that, we're going to look at a really familiar story out of the life of Jesus. This is a passage we probably all know really well, and it's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it's a parable, so let's just get it out there. This is not Jesus telling a real life story. This is him making something up. It's not a real event. But it's going to demonstrate how we can play our part in the bigger story of life. If you have a paper Bible and you want to open it, or one of these things on your phone and want to follow along, we're in Luke chapter 10. We're going to be starting at verse 25. And just so you know up front, quite a few of these ideas this morning I'm taking from a guy called Levi Lusko, who's another preacher. He's going to kind of help us along the way. So, the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10, starting at verse 25. Starts like this. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? An expert in the law, we might call that person a lawyer. Imagine, a lawyer is set to test Jesus. And Jesus doesn't answer with an answer. He says, what's written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? Don't you hate people like that? You ask them a question and they come back with another question. They don't give you a direct answer. Does that ring any bells over the last week or so? People you might have seen on the news, you ask them a question and yeah. Well, Jesus is employing the same tactic here. He's not giving a straight answer. In fact, Jesus is using what we call the Socratic method, developed by the Greek philosopher Socrates. The Socratic method is a dialogue between teacher and student. And the idea is that you continually probe the student with questions in a concerted effort to explore their underlying beliefs, the things that are shaping their views and opinions. So rather than just give an answer, what do you think? Let's get to the bottom of what you kind of believe about this. Anyway, he, the lawyer, answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind." We know that really well. "And love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." Pretty good. Jesus has no more questions. The lawyer has nailed it. However, we're talking about a lawyer, and a lawyer has plenty to say. The lawyer says he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" That's the question we skirt around all the time, don't we, when we hear this. Who is my neighbor? And Jesus answers with what is now a really familiar story. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then the man put him on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Okay, so there are 5 key men in this story. And as we kind of rattle through them, I want you to think, who do I most associate myself with? If you were putting yourself into this story, which of them would you be most like? If you were thinking about your own story, your own autobiography, which one would you kind of reflect? Let's have a look at them closely. First, there is the priest. He's just come from the temple, yet he passes by the beaten man. Secondly, there's the Levite. The Levite is a worship leader. He's probably just been playing guitar in church, or organ, or timbrel, or something. But he's the worship leader. Both the priest and the Levite are obligated by God to care for people like this beaten man. Yet the Levite, too, simply passes by. Now, what we probably need to know in this story is that when Jesus is talking about this road between Jerusalem and Jericho, it's not a great highway. It's not a 6-lane motorway. It's not a big road. Maybe we hear this account and our mind goes to the idea of the Levite and the priest passing over to the other side, walking on the other pavement. We've kind of all done it, haven't we? We've seen someone that we don't really want to talk to, put our head down, cross over the road and pretend we haven't seen. Is it just me? Okay. Fair enough. It's the glasses usually have very difficult see-through. But this isn't this great highway of a road. It's a very dangerous road where bandits would often operate, but at points it's extremely narrow. And the intimation, at least here, is that to pass by this beaten man, they've even got to step over him. It's not a case of being on the other side of the pavement. He's right there, and they're actually stepping over to get past him. So we look at the story, we examine the priest and the Levite, and we pour scorn on them. We kind of think, well, who would ever do that? But maybe before we get too judgmental about these two, remember this phrase. We judge others by their actions. We judge ourselves by our intentions. That's true, isn't it? We kind of look at what other people do and we judge them by their actions, by what they do. When it comes to ourselves, we know what's in our mind. So we kind of judge ourselves by our intentions. They just stepped over this beaten guy in the road. I was on my way to a very important meeting and therefore I had to step over the... See what I mean? We judge other people by actions, ourselves by our intentions. I wonder if there have been times in our story when we've been the priest or the Levite. What do we do when we come across a situation like that? What do we do when injustice raises its ugly head? Are we so busy that we can't stop and help? As we get into this story, maybe that should just cause us to pause and ponder for a while. Then thirdly, into our story walks this Samaritan. And in many ways, we're called to like this man. I mean, of course, we know that Jews hated Samaritans and vice versa to such an extent that Jews used to pray, thank God there are no Samaritans in the resurrection. They really didn't like them at all. And so when Jesus intimates to those listening that they should like this man, the Samaritan, this is really tough. But not so for us. I don't have any problem with people who come from Samaria. I'll be honest, I'm not even quite sure where it is, but I don't have a problem with them. Not at all. When it comes to fitting ourselves into the story, actually most of us want to be like this person. Most of us want to be the Samaritan. And we want to be that because he does three things that we like. And we like him because what he does is not about success. It's about significance, making a difference in the world. You see, he notices, he feels, and he acts. He noticed, he saw this man. I mean, he really saw him. It wasn't a case of seeing him and stepping over him. He absolutely saw what he was and what he was going through. And then he took pity on him. Pity, another word for pity in this kind of story is compassion. The Pharisees' issue wasn't that they didn't know what to do, it was they had this lack of compassion. They'd lost compassion for people. But the Samaritan had compassion. He felt something for the man. And then he acted. He lifted him up. I think that's a great phrase to have following you around. He lifted him up. Imagine if on your tombstone it wrote, or the words said, she lifted others up. He lifted others up. I mean, that would be a great thing, wouldn't it, to have on your tombstone? It'd be much better than Spike Milligan's I told you I wasn't well, wouldn't it, you know? I think that would be a great phrase also to be attached to the church. We saw, then we felt, we lifted others up. We got off our high horse and we did something. Do you know, I think we've done this recently, and a big thanks to those that got involved. Kind of the backstory is the Route to Freedom guys who we helped support picked up this woman who was sleeping rough in Ipswich, passed them on to Jan, who started to help her. And this lady had been sleeping in a doorway for months, I think, in the town centre in Ipswich, homeless, not on alcohol, not on drugs, working. Circumstances dictated she couldn't get herself into housing, sleeping rough. So Jan helped her get into a house or into a flat. And I know in the last week, we've kind of said she's desperate for some stuff. She was desperate for a cooker and a fridge freezer, among other things. The council, despite saying they would provide them, really hadn't come through with anything. So kind of the call went out, and For those who got involved, thank you, because she's now got a fridge freezer, she's got a cooker, and that came from the body of this church, which is like amazing. In fact, she's now got a sofa bed to sleep on. So originally she'd got a flat, but was still having to sleep on the floor. But at least it was inside. I think it shows we saw, we felt, we lifted someone else up. That's the way we should be, surely. We are marked by the love of Christ. We should be like the Good Samaritan. Greenfinch Church should be marked out not by how good the Sunday service is or the talk or the numbers attending, but how much the practical love of God flows out of us. And we all know that practical love is desperately needed right now, isn't it? Absolutely. I mean, our news channels have been bombarded with we all know what over the last week. But the second, the third story is always about people struggling just to get by, to live in this world. In fact, we got an email a couple of weeks back from somebody at Suffolk One saying would we get involved in a food collection for Christmas for those in need. I don't know. Maybe we would. We also know down at the library there's like an impromptu food bank constantly going on. Maybe we'd get involved in that. I don't know. What I know is that what's needed desperately now is that practical love. The Samaritan's practical love. Anyway, moving on, there are also two other people in this story. There's the beaten man. Maybe the beaten man is more like you and me than the Samaritan. He's not the Good Samaritan. He needs a Good Samaritan. And sometimes so do I, and so do you. And what we need more than anything, most of us kind of know this, but we need Jesus. He is the one who came down from heaven, crossed boundaries, crossed racial and cultural boundaries, gave his life for his enemies. He is the Good Samaritan, not us. You know, because we've all been there, that even though you might call yourself a Christian, even though you kind of put yourself under the guidance of God, that sometimes you can feel that life has beaten you up and just left you on the road. And you need Jesus. And Jesus comes into this story as the hero, the Good Samaritan. You see, at times we can be the Good Samaritan for others, but at times we can be the beaten man. At times we can be the Levite or the priest. Let me put this out to you as we kind of draw this more to a close. Maybe more than any of these four people, as the Church of Jesus Christ, as Christ followers, maybe we are meant to be the innkeeper. Excuse me a sec. You see, the innkeeper is the one who looks after the ones that the Good Samaritan brings to his door. Surely that's the role of the church. We love and care and nurture and put back on their feet those who the Good Samaritan brings to our door. And here's the thing, I think, if we call ourselves Christ followers genuinely, then the Good Samaritan is going to bring people to our door if we have the eyes to see them. If, like the Good Samaritan in the story, we don't just see them and walk over them, but we genuinely see them, then Jesus is going to bring those people to our door. We all know, kind of from a few years back now, Armet, who came in. Well, most of us know Armet. Some of you won't, I guess. I think that was Jesus, the Good Samaritan, bringing somebody, a beaten man, to our door. To just say, can you look after him? Can you do something about it? And church, you were brilliant with him. God will continue to do that if we have the willingness to open up the life we have. If we have the willingness to open up the space you have to say, I'll do what it takes to bandage the wounds, to help that person stand on their feet again, then that ushers significance into our story above success. That kind of thing makes the story I'll tell far more interesting. Actually, I think as we read through this story, I think because we know it so well, we miss some of the nuances of it. And one of the things I think we sometimes miss is we're told that the Good Samaritan gave the innkeeper 2 denarii. That's going to put him up in the hotel for a little while. He kind of just didn't leave him with the innkeeper and say, it's your responsibility. He provided the funds for that. Basically, he said to the innkeeper, this guy's going to take a little bit to fix him, to put him right. In other words, it's not a quick deal. This guy is beaten up badly. He's in a mess. The innkeeper's going to have to roll up his sleeves and properly get involved for a while. Do you know, as we kind of accept the people that our Good Shepherd brings in, it's going to get messy. It is messy to help people in our culture. Church is going to get messy. But maybe if it's not messy, it's not the church that Jesus envisioned in the first place. Imagine coming into Greenfinch Church and everybody here was perfect, not a care in the world. Everything was wonderful. We were all happy. All right, some of you could look happy. I mean, that would help if some were at least, but that's not the church that Jesus envisioned. I'm convinced of that we are much more the kind of the hospital, the inn where the beaten man can be brought, than just a place where perfect people get together. Church is going to be messy. In our story, it's really messy. Think about it. This guy is beaten, no doubt bloody, maybe broken ribs, broken bones. He's in a really bad state. And the innkeeper is called to break his routine for the sake of someone who needed help. Can we be the church that God needs for this broken and hurting world? Of course we can. Luke 10:35. The Good Samaritan says to the innkeeper, "Look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you have." You see, the Good Samaritan, when we get down to it, is a picture of Jesus. Because what's being said here is Messiah language. When I return, I will make things right for you. When I return, I will restore what is depleted. What you have given to others on my behalf, I will give back. As much as you did for the least of these, you did for me. It's in the words of Revelation that we hear Jesus say, I've seen your good deeds, your perseverance. You cared for people when it hurt you. You loved people when they didn't love you back. You gave financially when nobody acknowledged it and nobody saw it. You loved and gave, and I will reward you. And maybe some of us need to hear that right now, because this can be really difficult, and it can seem kind of lonely, and it can seem that nobody notices, and maybe you're desperate to tell people, but you know that what you're doing kind of needs to stay hidden because that's the way of Christ. Maybe you need to hear right now that Jesus said you might feel depleted and worn out, but you need to know that the Good Shepherd will reimburse you, will restore you. So, bringing all this to a conclusion, how do we play our part in the bigger story? Well, we don't make it all about ourselves. A wasted story is when it's all about me. See, my story is when I take my one and only life and say, Jesus, how can I be the innkeeper? Who is it that you want me to bandage and look after and lift up? Jesus, I want to be that person who, when you bring someone to my door, is willing to disrupt my life for the sake of them, for the sake of someone else, and ultimately for your glory. Because when we give, then we save our life, and then we live a life worth living. Right now, history is being written, in that our story is being written. What will it say? The end of the day, when you get to chapter 22 and you write those fateful 2 words, the end, what will it say? Will it say that we just clung on for survival, that it was all about me, that it was about success, that I allowed myself to be inward looking? Or as Christ followers, as a church, do we allow the Good Samaritan to disrupt our lives so that we can help those beaten and broken on the road? When we give ourselves to others, we don't just end up saving ourselves, but we end up giving honor to Jesus as well. And that's what we're called to do. And it can't all just be through singing a few songs every week. The truth of the matter is, if it wasn't for Jesus, the Good Samaritan, and I suspect quite a lot of you too, would still be on the road, still trudging through life, going nowhere. But he's lifted us up. He's kind of put us back on track. He's bandaged our wounds time and time again. And he asks us to do the same for others. When we allow him to interrupt our life, then we can begin to play a small part in someone else's story, which means that our story is now part of a bigger story. We're going to continue with this theme over the next, kind of ad hoc, I guess, because of things coming up, but over the next few weeks up to Christmas. In the meantime, let me pray for you before we close with a couple of songs. Father God, I thank you that you didn't leave us to be. You didn't leave us to go through life in a mundane way. You didn't leave us when we were beaten and bloodied and bruised. Even now, you don't do that. Lord, you stepped down out of heaven that we might know significance in our lives rather than just striving after success. Father, would you seal into our hearts today what that means? How that means for us to be the innkeeper in this story. That then our story becomes part of a much bigger story as we affect and infect other lives around us. How we become part of their story too. How we all kind of mesh together in the one story of Jesus ruling this world. Help us to play our parts, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.